Look at your hands for a moment, not casually, but with the kind of attention you normally reserve for something important. The lines crossing your palms have been there for years. Some of the marks carry stories you still remember, while others appeared so long ago that they have become part of the background of your life. These are the same hands that carried your childhood fears, your teenage insecurities, your private disappointments, and every dream you once believed would change everything. They have remained with you through every chapter of your existence. They were there when you thought you knew exactly who you were, and they were there when life proved you wrong. Yet despite how familiar they seem, something about them feels strangely different. The hands are the same, but the person looking through them is not entirely the same person anymore. Somewhere along the way, without a dramatic announcement and without a clear dividing line, parts of your old identity began falling away. The strange thing is that you cannot point to the exact moment it happened. You cannot identify a single conversation, a single loss, a single breakthrough, or a single victory and say, "That was the day I changed." The transformation happened quietly. It happened while you were busy focusing on other things. It happened during ordinary mornings, routine conversations, forgotten disappointments, and seemingly insignificant moments that did not appear important at the time. And now you occasionally find yourself wondering when the person you used to be became someone you only remember. Perhaps you have already noticed the signs. Not the dramatic signs people talk about in books or videos, but the subtle ones. The ones that arrive without explanation. You notice that certain things no longer upset you the way they once did. A criticism that would have followed you around for days now disappears before dinner. A disagreement that once demanded your full emotional attention now feels strangely unimportant. You stop feeling the need to explain every decision you make. You stop mentally rehearsing conversations before they happen. You stop replaying interactions long after they are over. At first, these changes seem small, almost insignificant, but eventually you realize they are pointing towards something much larger. They are revealing that your relationship with yourself is changing. And once that relationship begins changing, everything else starts changing with it. One of the strangest experiences during this period is the realization that the people around you often continue seeing the version of you that no longer exists. They remember your old ambitions. They remember your old fears. They remember the goals you used to talk about endlessly and the insecurities you tried so hard to hide. Sometimes they bring these things up in conversation, and for a brief moment it feels as though they are describing somebody else. You smile because you recognize the person they are talking about, but you no longer fully identify with them. It is like looking through an old photo album and realizing that every picture belongs to you, yet none of them fully capture the person you are today. The world has not caught up to your transformation because most of it happened in silence. And because it happened in silence, there are moments when you wonder whether anyone else can see it at all. Carl Jung believed that some of the most important events in a human life occur entirely within the psyche. They leave no visible evidence behind. Nobody congratulates you when a fear quietly loses its power. Nobody notices when your need for approval begins fading. Nobody applauds when you stop building your identity around the opinions of people who never truly understood you in the first place. Yet these invisible changes often alter the course of a life more profoundly than any external achievement. According to Jung, many people spend years constructing an identity designed for survival. They learn how to adapt. They learn what earns acceptance and what invites rejection. They learn which parts of themselves should be displayed and which parts should remain hidden. Over time, this adaptation becomes so familiar that they mistake it for who they really are. They become experts at maintaining an image while remaining strangers to their own depths. The problem with living this way is that eventually the image becomes too small. The life you built around external expectations begins feeling restrictive. The goals that once excited you begin losing their emotional charge. The approval that once felt essential begins feeling strangely empty. This confuses many people because they assume dissatisfaction means something is wrong. They assume they need a new goal, a new achievement, a new relationship, or a new source of motivation. But sometimes dissatisfaction is not a signal that you need more. Sometimes it is a signal that you have outgrown something. Sometimes the discomfort you feel is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of evolution. It is the psyche's way of informing you that an old identity can no longer contain the person you are becoming. You may have already experienced this without realizing it. There was probably a time when success seemed capable of solving almost everything. You imagined that reaching a certain destination would finally provide the peace you were searching for. Maybe it was a financial goal. Maybe it was a relationship. Maybe it was recognition, status, influence, or achievement. Whatever form it took, you believed that once you arrived there, something inside you would finally settle. Yet, if you are honest, you have probably noticed a pattern. Every destination eventually becomes normal. Every achievement eventually becomes part of the background. Every victory eventually loses the emotional intensity it once carried. And this realization forces a difficult question into consciousness. What if the thing you have been searching for cannot be found where you have been looking? This question marks the beginning of a deeper journey. Not a journey toward more success, but a journey toward greater self-knowledge. And one of the first things that changes on this journey is your relationship with uncertainty. For most of life, uncertainty feels threatening because the ego wants control. It wants guarantees. It wants to know exactly what will happen next. But life rarely provides such certainty. In fact, some of the most meaningful experiences in life arrive disguised as confusion. They arrive during periods when the old map no longer works, and the new map has not yet appeared. They arrive when you are forced to move forward without knowing exactly where you are going. This is uncomfortable, but it is also necessary. Because transformation requires stepping beyond familiar identities, and familiar identities rarely disappear without resistance. As this process deepens, you may notice that an internal conflict that once dominated your life begins losing its intensity. There was a time when your mind felt like a battlefield. One part of you wanted security while another wanted freedom. One part wanted acceptance while another wanted authenticity. One part wanted change while another feared it. Every decision felt heavy, because every decision seemed to involve a struggle between competing versions of yourself. Yet lately something feels different. The arguments inside your head do not last as long. The need to control every outcome begins fading. You become more comfortable admitting that you do not have all the answers. You stop treating uncertainty as an emergency. And perhaps most importantly, you stop assuming that every thought deserves your complete attention. This creates a kind of psychological space that did not exist before, a space in which awareness becomes larger than the conflict itself. At the same time, your relationship with emotions begins changing. Instead of viewing emotions as obstacles, you start seeing them as information. Fear is no longer something to eliminate immediately. Sadness is no longer something to escape as quickly as possible. Anger is no longer something to suppress without examination. You begin listening rather than reacting. You become curious rather than defensive. And in that curiosity, you discover something surprising. Many of the emotions you spent years trying to avoid were carrying messages you needed to hear. They were not enemies. They were guides. They were pointing toward parts of your life that required attention, honesty, or change. And this is where the journey takes a turn that many people never expect. Because beneath the fears you have managed, beneath the emotions you have explored, and beneath the identity you have spent years constructing, there exists another dimension of yourself entirely. A hidden territory that influences your choices, shapes your relationships, and quietly determines much more of your life than you realize. It contains qualities you have rejected, strengths you have neglected, truths you have avoided, and possibilities you have never fully explored. Jung believed that every genuine transformation eventually leads a person toward this hidden territory. He called it the shadow. And according to him, the moment you become willing to meet it consciously is the moment your real journey finally begins. The shadow is rarely what people expect it to be. Most people imagine that if they ever encountered the hidden parts of themselves, they would immediately recognize them. They imagine the shadow would appear as anger, jealousy, selfishness, resentment, or some other quality they have spent years trying to avoid. But the shadow is far more subtle than that. In many cases, the shadow appears disguised as the very things you cannot understand about yourself. It appears in the reactions that seem larger than the situation requires. It appears in the qualities you admire in others, but struggle to claim within yourself. It appears in the recurring patterns that follow you from one chapter of life to another. It appears in the strange discomfort you feel around certain people without knowing exactly why. The truth is that the shadow contains not only what you dislike about yourself, but also what you have neglected, denied, abandoned, or hidden in order to become acceptable. It contains strengths that never had a chance to develop. It contains truths that were never spoken. It contains desires that were pushed aside because they conflicted with the image you were trying to maintain. And this is why meeting the shadow often feels less like discovering something foreign and more like remembering something you have known all along. Perhaps you have already experienced moments like this. Moments when you suddenly realized that an emotional reaction had less to do with the present and more to do with something deeper. Moments when you discovered that a criticism hurt so much because it touched a part of yourself you had never fully accepted. Moments when you noticed that the qualities you judged most harshly in others were often qualities you feared within yourself. These realizations can be uncomfortable because they dismantle the simple stories we tell ourselves. They force us to recognize that we are more complicated than we imagined. Yet they also create freedom, because the moment you become conscious of what has been operating in the shadows, it loses much of its power to control you. You stop being driven by forces you do not understand. You stop fighting invisible battles. And for the first time, you begin bringing hidden parts of yourself into the light of awareness. As this process unfolds, something unexpected begins happening. You become less interested in appearing good and more interested in being honest. There was a time when maintaining an image felt important. You wanted people to see you a certain way. You wanted to be perceived as intelligent, capable, successful, kind, strong, or whatever qualities seemed necessary at the time. But gradually that performance becomes exhausting. Not because you stop caring about how you treat others, but because you realize that constantly managing an image creates distance between yourself and reality. You begin valuing authenticity over appearance. You become willing to admit uncertainty. You become willing to acknowledge flaws. You become willing to say, "I don't know," when you do not know. And strangely enough, this honesty often makes you stronger rather than weaker. The energy once spent protecting an image becomes available for living a more genuine life. One of the clearest signs that this transformation is taking place is the way your relationship with validation begins changing. There was a time when approval felt like nourishment. A compliment from the right person could elevate your mood for days. A criticism from the wrong person could occupy your thoughts long after everyone else had forgotten it. You measured yourself through the reactions of others without even realizing you were doing it. But now something feels different. You still appreciate kindness. You still value meaningful feedback. Yet the emotional grip has weakened. You no longer feel compelled to convince everyone of your worth. You no longer feel responsible for correcting every misunderstanding. In fact, one of the strangest developments may be that you have become comfortable allowing some people to see you incorrectly. Not because you have given up on being understood, but because you finally recognize that being understood by everyone was never possible in the first place. This realization frees an extraordinary amount of energy. The energy once spent managing perceptions becomes available for something far more important: understanding yourself. And as you begin understanding yourself more deeply, another realization emerges. Many of the goals that once consumed your attention were never really about the goals themselves. They were about what you believed those goals would give you. You thought success would give you certainty. You thought achievement would give you worth. You thought recognition would give you peace. You thought the future would eventually provide something the present could not. Yet if you look honestly at your life, you have probably noticed a pattern. Every achievement eventually becomes normal. Every milestone eventually fades into memory. Every destination eventually turns into another starting point. The excitement is real, but it never lasts as long as you expect. And hidden inside this observation is one of the most important truths a person can discover. The future cannot complete an identity that has never learned to accept itself. Carl Jung believed that much of human suffering comes from searching for ourselves in places where the self cannot be found. We search in accomplishments, relationships, possessions, status, and recognition. None of these things are inherently wrong. They can enrich life, they can create meaningful experiences, but they cannot answer the deeper question that follows every human being through every stage of existence. Who are you when everything external is removed? Who are you beneath the role you play, beneath the reputation you protect, beneath the achievements you celebrate, beneath the expectations you inherited from other people? Jung believed that individuation begins the moment this question becomes more important than the answers society offers. It begins when you become genuinely curious about your own depths, not because you are trying to improve yourself, but because you are trying to know yourself. This curiosity changes the way you experience daily life. You begin noticing that simplicity feels more satisfying than stimulation. There was a time when constant activity felt necessary. Constant noise, constant distraction, constant movement toward the next thing. But now you find yourself appreciating quieter experiences. A meaningful conversation becomes more valuable than endless social interaction. A peaceful morning becomes more fulfilling than constant entertainment. A few trusted relationships become more meaningful than a large audience. The world itself has not changed, but your relationship to it has. You begin realizing that much of what once felt important was simply loud, and once the noise loses its appeal, you become capable of hearing things you previously overlooked. You also discover that uncertainty no longer frightens you in the same way. This does not mean you enjoy uncertainty. It means you stop treating it as evidence that something is wrong. There was a time when not knowing the future felt unbearable. You wanted guarantees. You wanted clarity. You wanted proof that everything would work out exactly as planned. But life has a way of teaching a different lesson. Again and again, you survive situations you once thought would destroy you. Again and again, you adapt to circumstances you never anticipated. Again and again, you discover strengths you did not know you possessed. And eventually, a quiet confidence begins emerging. Not confidence that everything will go according to plan, but confidence that you will be able to meet whatever arrives. This kind of trust is very different from certainty. It is deeper, more stable, less dependent on circumstances. All of these changes gradually converge into a realization that is difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore. The person you spent years trying to become was never the destination. For much of life, growth appears to be about becoming more successful, more respected, more accomplished, more confident, more admired. But genuine transformation reveals something unexpected. The goal was never to become someone else. The goal was to become more fully yourself, not the version shaped entirely by fear,